Thank you so much. Can you see that?
It's fantastic, yes.
Okay, very good. Except it's not started at the beginning. There we go. So thanks so much for the opportunity. So this title is different to the one that you have. My apologies. I think Sarah and I, when we started sort of talking through what we wanted to say, realized that the work we wanted to present is still evolving and probably wouldn't be ready in time for your very tight deadlines. But at the same time, we've been working on this sort of arena around the intersection between conservation and ABS, and we saw it as a gap perhaps in the book, and we thought this might be an important sort of new contribution. So my apologies for shifting topics, and I hope it's useful. So really what we want to talk about today is what we're calling the missing link, and the fact that while ABS was initially conceptualized as this incentive and funding mechanism for conservation, while of course addressing inequities, it's largely been ignored. You know, in the 1990s, there was a lot of attention around trying to dig into that link a little bit more deeply, some really interesting case studies from Costa Rica. I know there's been some really interesting work also in Queensland with AstraZeneca around marine biodiscovery. So there's sort of these pockets of examples, particularly from the early years of CBD implementation. But since then, things have gone pretty silent, and the focus has been around sort of enabling equity and fairness, rather than trying to look at this link between conservation, access, and benefit sharing, which was really, you know, when the CBD was negotiated in 1992, that was, you know, one of the rationales for building in benefit sharing. It was, I think, one of the sort of the negotiating approaches that in exchange for access, there would be benefit sharing, but also that this benefit sharing would be used as an incentive to address the biodiversity crisis, much more of a crisis now than it was then. So, which makes it even more bizarre that it's really being neglected. So I think more and more now there is increasing attention, but nonetheless Nagoya has pretty weak provisions around conservation. And I think, you know, one of the reasons that it is so often is it analyzes so differently across different sectors and across different resources. You know, what it means for somebody commercializing sort of a raw material, so-called biotrade, the benefits there are mostly linked to sustainable use, whereas as soon as one brings in biodiscovery, it's much more around research partnerships, tech transfer, capacity development. And then, you know, with DSI, well, I think there's a huge question, what does it mean for conservation? So these are really important questions that we think need to be considered. And this diagram is just showing, I think, the variety of spheres across which conservation and access and benefit sharing intersect, sort of from the genetic level, from gene banks, botanic gardens, playing this incredibly important role in conservation, through to sustainable harvesting and trade, protected areas, these landscape approaches, RED+, CBN, community-based natural resource management, payments for ecosystem services, and then, you know, the capacity issues, the critical information that we need for biodiversity management that could arise through ABS partnerships. So they're really important opportunities. Some of them are fairly easy to obtain, but they just haven't been adequately leveraged. And we wanted to focus in this paper on the governance component, and there are many different aspects to it, and we're involved in a project in South Africa, Namibia, Cameroon, and Madagascar, where we're really trying to look at a national level how one actually embeds conservation into national laws and policies. And what we're finding is that, you know, there's this variety of laws for conservation. We got a wonderful quote from one of the people we interviewed, said, conservation is everywhere, but it's nowhere. There are so many laws, but none of them are intersecting with access and benefit sharing. And one of the reasons is that implementation is a real challenge, policing and enforcement, particularly in the countries that we've been looking at. There's a lack of capacity, there's very low budgets that are allocated towards implementation. And often with ABS, this focus on regulatory compliance and equity, justifiably equity, has turned attention away from conservation and sustainable use. So certainly in my country, the government officials are mostly involved with sort of ticking the boxes and making sure that there's compliance, but without actually asking these bigger questions of whether justice has been served and whether conservation has been attained. And certainly in my country, the answer is no for both of those. So yeah, there's this feeling that conservation is everywhere and it's nowhere. There's a range of statutory laws, policies and initiatives, none of them very strongly linked to access and benefit sharing, although, you know, they might be mentioned, but then when it comes to actual implementation, and for example, providers, users having to show how they're embedding conservation into benefit sharing agreements, there's very little there, and there's very little guidance given to users as well about how they can do that. I mean, one of the central pillars is around customary law, particularly in countries where customary law is still strong and communities where it's still strong. And many of these customary practices and laws have very strong components linked to conservation and sustainable use. But these are not being sort of adequately brought into the picture. I mean, we're seeing a number of biocultural protocols being rolled out, but they stay at quite an abstract level and aren't necessarily sort of engaging with this connection, although it is a pretty obvious connection. There's some really interesting approaches. For example, Brazil has put in place legislation now, which I think is quite interesting to look at. They've prioritized projects that companies can implement, conservation projects, and they've also established various funding mechanisms, which users can contribute to. So I think those are some interesting cases that we can start learning from. Going back to the traditional knowledge issues, I think what we're starting to see as well is that sometimes traditional knowledge and resources have been separated in the implementation of benefit sharing agreements. So agreements might be shared or connected from the resources which knowledge holders might have custodianship over. So in those ways, conservation is mostly pushed aside. Sorry, I'm going to go quite fast because I know I don't have too much time. So we're seeing that it's not necessarily only about ABS laws, it's sort of this bigger context is as important. The lack of legal recognition of land and resource rights it makes conservation initiatives much less likely to succeed. So ABS can be seen, so it's not necessarily only sort of this compliance mechanism, but it can be seen as an opportunity to strengthen the links to conservation, but also to enable strengthened rights for communities who have insecure tenure or sort of poorly defined rights at a national level. So part of what we've been looking at is some of the mechanisms that can strengthen conservation, and I won't go into this now, but it will be summarized in the paper, where we're looking at sort of the pros and cons of different kinds of approaches, sort of national trust funds versus NGOs managing funds versus research institutions, the kinds of benefits that emerge, monetary and non-monetary, and how one can institutionalize those, both in the law and then in the implementation through different approaches. And I mean, some of the conclusions are that there are a range of tools that already exist, that we don't necessarily need to be reinventing the wheel, but just making those connections much more strongly. That embedding conservation as a fundamental principle and component of any ABS agreement from the start is probably a key aspect. That's not being done at the moment. It's kind of an add-on. It's not mandatory. It's seen as a nice to have if you want to include it. But again, I think users and providers just don't have much guidance about how this can be done. And there's some fairly simple things, just ensuring that, there's good taxonomic knowledge that emerges out of a project, for example, that goes back to source country, that's embedded in national inventories. That tends to happen, but it's not thought through in a very strategic way. Requiring monetary benefits to go back to entities that will implement conservation, and then linking with Indigenous peoples and local communities to share benefits, but not to be placing the burden of implementation on communities. And I think this context of conservation, certainly in the global South, and particularly in the current context where these nature-based solutions are being seen as an expansion of protected areas, often undermining the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. That context is so critical to bear in mind because of the legacies of colonialism, in my country, apartheid, of moving people off protected areas to make way for nature, but without considering rights. So, one has to embed sort of the implementation of conservation and ABS in this wider political and social landscape. Linking traditional knowledge and stewardship of genetic and biological resources within laws, particularly recognizing that sort of 80% of the world's biodiversity is managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities. And then linking, the range of different actors, private landowners through to conservation managers and other resource providers, to very clear conservation actions where there's sort of very tangible options that can be implemented. So it's not seen as something that's generic, but really, where the countries come up with priority lists, or whether it's linked to national biodiversity strategy and action plans, just to concretize that as far as possible. Coordination is critical. We're seeing conservation implemented by many different ministries and at many different levels. So, fitting into that network that already exists is a really important component. Using approaches that are tried and tested. Again, conservation has been around for a very long time. So it's not about reinventing the wheel, and it's very much about partnerships. And it's very much about having these, sorry, my dog is barking and I can't shut her up. It's about having very clear guidelines for the decision makers, so that conservation is embedded as a principle around decision making when benefit sharing agreements and permits are agreed and negotiated. And then bringing in sort of wide and diverse range of stakeholders in relevant boards and committees that oversee ABS implementation and that have conservation interests in mind. We haven't seen that other structures that have been set up to implement ABS. So that's really my sort of conclusion is sort of ABS. It's not a silver bullet. I think we need to recognize that the monetary benefits that emerge from ABS, certainly at the moment, without DSI in the picture, are not that significant. The non-monetary benefits are generally much more important for biodiversity conservation in terms of research, information, management. But, opportunities leveraged from DSI, I think, are really potentially important. And again, those are, it's not going to be the make or break solution for conservation funding, but it can make a really important contribution. And I'm following the sort of establishment of this Global Biodiversity Fund with interest. I think also sort of bearing in mind that ABS is just a drop in the ocean when we start looking at the big extractive industries and the taxes that they should be paying to such a fund. So that's all I have to say for now. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rachel, for that very important reminder about the conservation objectives of ABS and all those solutions. I have a quick question, actually. What kind of impact do you think the post-2020 biodiversity framework might have for recalibrating, ABS to its conservation objectives, if any?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. I think it's on everyone's minds. And I mean, I was part of the ministerial meeting last 2 weeks ago. And I mean, it really feels that I mean, DSI is this deal breaker. If we don't get DSI right, I think we should be jeopardizing the entire framework. But I do see increased recognition of the importance of conservation in the ABS space. I don't think that's, I think there is mention of it in the sort of the last version I saw, or certainly in the Kunming Declaration. I think there was sort of but yeah, I think it's certainly a space to watch and potentially influence.
Thanks, Rachel. Margaret put a comment in the box. Do you want to talk to the comment, Margaret?
It was just a brief comment, and my apologies. I'm like trying to manage some family obligations while also listening to your presentation. It was just, you made a comment around which I'm not sure if I heard correctly, but it was something around the recognition of the influence of land rights or that type of regime for ABS. And one thing I've noticed in working in Vanuatu and the Cook Islands, which have ratified the Nagoya Protocol, is it's a vastly different experience there to Australia. And I think personally it's because they have kept customary law and it's been embedded within legislation. So there's a basis, like all of the legislators and all of the people in Parliament all have a basic understanding around what it is, and they're also Indigenous. And so those conversations are not hard to have in Vanuatu and Cook Islands, but they're extremely hard to have in Australia because we just don't have that basic understanding. And I think that in Australia, I think that influences how we perceive the Nagoya Protocol and how it's likely to be implemented. It's just like this extra barrier that we have to contend with, that we don't have to contend with in Vanuatu or the Cook Islands.
Thanks, Margaret. Amber, you had a question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a naive question because actually in the microbiology world, we don't come that much into contact with IPLCs, or historically, I have not personally. But recently we've begun a collaboration with something called the Global Microbiome Conservancy. I might be getting the letters mixed up. But to make a long story short, they have worked incredibly proactively with a large number of Indigenous people to collect the microbiome, the gut bacteria that are in Indigenous people, and have done, I thought, a very nice job of collecting prior informed consent, of establishing benefit sharing, but they totally overlooked the Nagoya Protocol and asking permission of the national governments to do this, right? And it occurred to me, and again, it's naivete, and I don't know if this belongs in your book chapter, but I would love to hear yours or others' opinions on this. Actually, in a perfect world, the Nagoya Protocol should work, or this idea of access and benefit sharing should work, that should be enough, that you get the IPLC permission, you do a good job of making sure that their benefits and their rights are protected and ensured, and that system works. And then you shouldn't necessarily have to get an additional layer of permission. I mean, at the most, it should be like a registration, like, hey, here's what I did, and file the paperwork. But the actual reality is you have to start from scratch with the Environment Ministry in each of these, in this case, 15 different countries. Is it meant to be that way, or why aren't the IPLCs sign off and engagement and involvement enough? Is that a stupid or simple question, or is that like, I don't know. Why does the law work like that?
Maybe some of the lawyers could answer. I mean, from my perspective, it's because not every country recognizes Indigenous peoples in the way that they should. That's the simple answer. But I'm also aware that the CBD, sets up national governments as, doesn't require that you get prior informed consent from Indigenous. The first point of call is national government. I mean, that's how I'm understanding it. Access is provided by a national government.
Yeah, even though it's there, it's the gut contents, of these people. I can understand why they made this mistake, if you will, by not starting with the national governments, because it's sort of like, how can that be the right place to start? And I guess it's just sort of like, it feels to me almost as if it does lip service you know, the Nagoya Protocol in this content to indigenous people, where they don't even have the autonomy or the authority over the contents of their gut. You still have to start with a national environment authority to say, give me your poop. I mean, it's just sort of non-intuitive, and it seems sort of, yeah.
So I can butt in here is that the CBD is really clear that it's the UN Charter, which is what it's under, and that the UN Charter is what's implementing the CBD, and that's nation states recognized by the United Nations. So automatically, through the United Nations, we've obliterated any of the sort of the lower than state entities, and we're recognizing and reinforcing as Todd was talking about earlier today, the sovereign right of states and their United Nations states. We're talking about how we can get out of that in our United Nations forum is going to be really hard. You'll see that tacked on to all the United Nations agreements, there's almost always some kind of recognition of the state as the source of authority, the source of power, and the decision maker.
So I mean, the simple answer is the IPLC's never really had a chance. I mean, you can do whatever you want with TK or whatever you want in talking about prior informed consent and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, they've got no power because the nation state is the decider about access.
Unless the nation state gives them that power, as they have done in various places.
Which, to my knowledge, or none of these 15 did.
Yes, yeah, it's complicated problem. But maybe the United Nations is not actually the forum to resolve that particular problem. Remember, the United Nations Charter is a peace treaty to protect the sovereignty of the sovereignty in the UN Charter sense of the states which are recognised and signed up to the UN Charter. So it's almost like a gentleman's club to protect each other and exclude other people or other entities who are trying to disrupt that system. It's becoming better as we go ahead, but it's also institutionalized. The institution itself is unfortunately got that built into it.
Fascinating. Thank you, Charles.